Good afternoon to all of you. We are going to start our session where Professor Somobruto Acharya is going to resume his talk. Uh, but I think I would request Professor Acharya to start the lecture from the beginning because the audio was not clear from the beginning. And we have 1 hour of time, sir. So if you can unmute and then say that you can hear our voice and people can also hear your voice and we can start the session.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Okay, I unmuted.
Yes.
So am I clear now?
Absolutely clear, sir. And can you please press F5 to make the presentation full screen? Yeah.
Yes.
This is absolutely fine.
So,
Yeah. Please go ahead, sir.
okay.
Please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you very much again to Dr. Hussain and Dr. Ghosh for giving me this opportunity to share some of these things in this pandemic phase. Anyway, so I was talking about that introduction in the nanotechnology. So you all know about the semiconductor, right? So semiconductor has basically changed the entire industry. So after discovery of the semiconductor, the transistor was discovered in the Bell Laboratory in the year of 1947. So you can see the image of the transistor here. This is called the bulb electronics. And then this has been replaced by the solid state transistor that is called NPN or PNP kind of transistor. But this has entirely changed the whole industry. Then the concept of miniaturization has started with the famous lecture from Dr. Richard Feynman in Caltech in 1959. So he said at the time that that why can't we make them very small, make them little wires? The wires could be 10 or 100 atoms in diameter. So these basically introduce the concept of the miniaturization, and the journey of nanotechnology has started from there. Then Gordon Moore, in the year of 1965, suggested that the number of transistors in an integrated circuit will be doubled in every 2 years. Surprisingly, the trend is still maintained, and that's why the complexities are increasing. And that's why we can realize, see the ENIAC computer in the year of 1946, and now it has become the smartphone or even a touch screen computer or supercomputer. Everything came up because of this miniaturization concept. So as a result of that, the industries are naturally interested. For example, Toshiba, Hitachi, all these kind of leading industries, IBM, also Philips, they are doing different kind of jobs. But all these companies have invested lots of money and effort and research behind this nanotechnology. And you can see the utility products today, from the tennis racket to the garment, or even in the facial creams or anywhere, you will find the application of the nanotechnology. So if you see that something is written like that 25% SPF, this is what? This means that it will absorb 25% of UV rays. So that will protect your skin. How it is done? Because the nanoparticles are very small in size, so they can absorb the UV light there, and thus of that your skin will be protected there. So why this nanosize is interesting? Because it represents the intermediate state between the atomic and bulk states. So for example, in bulk semiconductor, you'll have the conduction band and valence band, and that two bands are separated by a forbidden gap. But in case of quantum dot, this forbidden gap actually basically increases, and these continuous energy bands, they become discrete in case of quantum dots. And if you take the atoms, atom won't have this much of levels, they have the atomic levels. But if you bring few atoms closer to each other, then this level will be locating nearby, like what we have in the quantum dot. That means the quantum dot is consisting of few hundred atoms or few atoms, 50 atoms, something like that. Okay, these you all know, right? The particle in a box. So we have a particle in a box within the infinite potential barrier, but there is finite possibility that of the tunneling of this ball outside. But if you plot the energy, that is actually inversely proportional to the square of the length of the box there, right? This implies what? If I narrow down this length, the energy will be increasing. So same concept is applicable in case of the quantum dots, because you see the quantum dot of 10 nanometer in diameter. So this is a transmission electron microscopy image of a quantum dot here. So this diameter is say 10 nanometer. This means what? This implies that the electrons or charge carriers cannot go beyond this 10 nanometer boundary. That means it is confined within 10 nanometer. So as a result of that, the energy increases a lot, and you will have the longer forbidden gap there in comparison to the bulk. So this gives you the real picture. So this is again the valence band and conduction band, and as a result of this quantum confinement, this band gap in case of nanocrystals is basically increasing. Okay, so this is a fundamental thing. This implies that you have to deal with the quantum mechanics, not with the classical mechanics in case of nanomaterials. So since you can vary the diameter, that means you can vary the confinement within these nanoparticles. So if you make the bigger to smaller particles, automatically this L will be decreasing. As a result of that, the forbidden gap will be increasing upon decreasing the size of the nanocrystal. So this implies that you can tune the band gap just by changing the size of these nanocrystals, and as a result of that, you will have the different caloric properties that you can obtain from this nanocrystal just by changing the size of these nanocrystals here. So this gives you to realize the high quality emitters. For example, this is the blue zinc selenide, this green zinc selenide, yellow zinc selenide, orange zinc selenide. That means what? I have the bigger particle here, and then I am reducing down the size of the particles, and I am getting high quality colors, but in different caloric regime. So not only the shape, size, also the shape of this nanocrystal can really change the electronic properties. For example, if you have a zero-dimensional dot like this, so the charge carriers will be confined from all three directions here. But if you have a one-dimensional rods or nanowires, then the charge carriers will be confined along this cross section, but allowed to move along this length. Can you see my cursor in your screen?
Yes.
You can see my cursor, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay, fine. So then, if you have a two-dimensional object like this, so the charge carrier will be confined across the thickness as shown is here, but allowed to move along the plane. Okay, so this changes the degree of confinement. That means if you change the shape of these nanocrystals, you can eventually change the degree of confinement, and eventually you can tune the electronic properties there. So how to do that? You see a classic example of lead sulfide. So this lead sulfide can be synthesized in the form of zero-dimensional dot, or also it can be one-dimensional nanorods. You see these are the nanorods, these white lines. Also, you can have a two-dimensional object like this. So one material composed of lead sulfide can be realized in three different shapes, and one can eventually tune the electronic properties there. Now, how shape is also controlling the band gap. Suppose you have a dot, quantum dot here, right? So in case of quantum dot, you have three different dimensions. So let us define that by means of Lx, Ly, and Lz. Okay. And if it is a spherical in shape, so Lx will be equal to Ly, will be equal to Lz. Fine. So we'll have one, we have a rod line. If you consider this cross section, so Lx and Ly is equal. So that's why these two term comes like this, and eventually you can realize the energy like this way. In case of nanowire, Lz is pretty long. So if Lz is pretty long, so this term can be neglected. So energy appears like that. And in case of quantum oil or two-dimensional sheets, we have only one dimension of confinement, that is along the thickness. So that's why the energy is only dependent on the dimension of the thickness there, right? Because the other two dimensions are infinite, so that those could be neglected. So if I ask a question right now that the size and shape are controlling the quantum confinement or controlling the caloric properties of a semiconductor. But what happens to gold? Bulk gold, we all know bulk gold is yellow in color. But if you see the nano gold, they could be of different colors. For example, this 30 nanometer gold particle is giving red color. Now, is basically a conductor. This implies that it doesn't have the band gap. So how would we change this coloring property? So this is actually not related to the tuning of the band gap by changing the size, etc., but it depends. It depends on the surface plasma. That means you have the collective oscillation on this material. So they will be interacting with these plasmons, and this plasmon will absorb light depending on the wavelength, and eventually you can see the color. So this is a bit different from what we have stated before in case of semiconductor there. Fine. So what are the material that are being synthesized in nanomaterial? Pristine semiconductors are silicon and germanium. We don't want to deviate a lot from silicon and germanium there. So if we see the periodic table, the silicon and germaniums are located along this position. So if you take the defined kind of material, for example, you take lead and you take sulfur, so you'll have the lead sulfide. You take cadmium, you take sulfur, so you'll have the cadmium sulfide. You take cadmium and selenium, so selenium, so you'll have the cadmium selenide there. So these are called the binary semiconductor. And if you have more than 2 elements, so it is ternary, and if you have more than 3 elements, it is quaternary. So one can basically synthesize all these kind of binary, ternary or quaternary crystals by choosing the elements from the periodic table there. So how to prepare these nanocrystals? These nanocrystals can be prepared in various ways actually. For example, one can have the vapor phase synthesis, that's called the molecular beam epit. One could have the solution phase synthesis, that is called the colloidal route or solvothermal route. Aqueous solution, one also can synthesize these nanocrystals, that's called the micellar route or hydrothermal methods. High temperature synthesis, that is called the organometallic routes, and those are being done in furnaces, because once you are doing the reaction at around say 100 degrees Celsius, you have to either by means of this aqueous solution or solution phase synthesis, but if these two cannot lead you to the high temperature like 1000 degrees Celsius. So in that case, you have to use the high temperature using some furnaces. Okay, one can also use the lithographic methods or different kind of templates. For example, if you have a mesoporous template like this, so you can fill these binary or ternary materials within mesopores, and if you remove the template, so you will have the template-based synthesis of these nanocrystals there. One can also use the stamping method. Stamping is very clear. So you have few parallel trenches like this. So you fill this with some kind of nanomaterial, then have a flow, and then we'll have linear nanocrystal like that, and you change the direction of the stump, so you can have the cross array like this. So all these kind of things can be used to synthesize the nanocrystals, but one often use the vapor liquid solid growth method. So in order to have the vapor liquid solid method, one needs to have some catalysis center. Okay, so because of this catalysis center, the nanocrystals will grow from this center. Okay, and eventually you will get some kind of structure, but you will have the catalyst within this nanocrystals. Also, one could have the chemical vapor deposition method. Chemical vapor deposition is also very easy. So you will have the suitable substrate, and then you purge the chemical vapors of these elements and cool it down. So eventually they will be deposited on top of the surface, and you will have the nanocrystals there. So this gives you some idea that how sorbothermal synthesis, that means synthesis in a pot, can be done. So this is the typical setup. You have a beaker like this, then it has to be within the inert atmosphere. So you take all the reagents, solvents within this beaker, fix the temperature somewhere, around say 100 degree, you can monitor that by means of a thermometer. And of course, you seal the entire system. And if you want to inject something additionally after that, you will syringe. Okay, so entire system is within the inert atmosphere because you don't need other elements like oxygen to be there. So that's how one can use the colloidal synthesis route for the designing of these nanocrystals. Now, is one thing is very important here, that if you want to have a very good distribution of these nanocrystals, you must use the ligand there. Ligand means if you won't use the ligands, so these are the nanocrystals there. So if you won't have this kind of ligands, these are the organic molecules, then these two nanocrystals will come closer and will form the aggregated structure. So once you have this aggregated structure, you cannot control the shape or sizes there. So ligands are must in the synthesis of sorbothermal synthesis of nanocrystals. Okay, so these are the typical type of ligands. I'm just giving the I'm presenting in front of the physics community. I don't want to go into the details in the chemistry, but typically you will have some kind of binding groups. For example, here you have the NH2 group, and then you have the typical organic hydrocarbon chains. Okay, so these are the common structure of the ligands. You have different kind of, for example, octadecylamine, stearic acid. So this hydrocarbon part is common everywhere, and you have the different binding these nanocrystals and will restrict the growth along that crystallographic facet. So that's why you are getting very small in size, small size nanocrystals, and also you can control the shape because depending on the nature of the ligand, the binding energy to certain facets will be different. And if your binding energy is low, then the nanocrystal will grow along that facet. Okay. So this gives you that what happens in a typical reactions. So once you are injecting the ingredients within your reaction system, first the nucleation occurs. So you'll have the small clusters of those elements there. And then once you are continuing the reaction, so these small clusters will come together to form a moderate size of nanocrystal there. Okay. And if you continue the reaction furthermore, many things can happen. These primary nanocrystal self-assemble within your reaction system, so they can self-assemble like that. Also, if you won't have the ligand in this side, so these nanocrystal can be adjoined during the reaction to form the oriented attachment assembly. Okay, and if you have a very good size of distribution at the initial phase, then this can grow as a crystal. Fine. So different, think about it in a reaction system. If you have a different kind of distribution, so if you have all kind of nanoparticles which are uniform in size, then nothing will happen. This is called the homogeneous growth, and these nanocrystal will grow homogeneously and all along all directions. But think in a situation where you have a distribution of the nucleation. Some particles are bigger, some particles are smaller, then what will happen? Very interestingly, this bigger particle will consume the smaller particles here. So this process is called ripening. That means this bigger particle will eventually consume the smaller particles and eventually can form more bigger particle in the reaction systems. Okay, so this is called the ripening, and it was first observed by Ostwald. So what could happen? There are two different regimes in this reaction system. One is thermodynamically controlled and other is kinetically controlled. From the name, you can itself recognize that if you have the kinetic control regime, that means the reaction is going on. Okay, and if you have thermodynamically controlled regime, so you give some thermodynamically energy, and ultimately it will form the stable product, but very quickly it won't be, the reaction won't be continued there. But if you have a kinetically controlled regime, the reaction will go on there. Very interestingly, if you see the activation energy means that if you want to do some kind of reaction, you need a threshold to that reaction to be continued. So here EA represents the activation energy. So in case of this thermodynamically controlled reaction, you see the EA, which is usually larger than the activation energy of the kinetically controlled regime. Okay, this implies if you want to have a reaction in the thermodynamically controlled regime, you need to give more energy at the initial phase to that reaction system. And if you want to have the kinetically controlled product, then you give little lower energy and continue that reaction for longer time. Fine. So once we have this kind of nanomaterials, so what do we do with these things? First thing, we need to characterize that one. Okay. So basic thing to characterize these nanoparticles, you use the optical absorption spectrum. So this is very clear that optical absorption spectrum, what it does. It basically, once light impinges on the quantum dot or nanocrystal, the light will be absorbed. So as a result of that, the electron will be thrown from the valence to the conduction band. And depending on the wavelength, you will have the different transition energies, and that is being reflected as a spectra, absorption spectrum here. Okay. And from this absorption spectrum, if you take the lowest energy, basically that reflects the band gap. So eventually you can calculate the band gap by just measuring the absorption spectrum of these quantum dots here. Now, once you are exciting these electrons to the conduction states, then eventually these electrons will come down to the ground state again. And if they will recombine with the holes, so basically you will get emission of light. So these two processes are replication of each other, right? One is absorption, where you are lifting the electron to the conduction states, and emission is coming down of the electron to the valence state and recombination with a hole. So you see that there's some energy which is being lost during the process, because once the electron will be in the excited state, that needs to come to the bottom of the excited state. So that basically consumes some kind of energy. So that's why you will find some kind of energy gap between the absorption and the emission spectrum there. So that exactly being reflected from this energy gap, and this energy gap is called the Stokes shift. Okay. So if you want to calculate the Stokes shift there, so it's very easy to calculate. We all know that the famous equation E equal to h nu. That means E equal to hc by lambda. So now you have the wavelength for the absorption wavelength peak, and you have the wavelength for the emission peak. So just you put is not the difference in the wavelength there, because Stokes shift means it is a kind of energy that you are reflecting there. So that's why you need to put it individual wavelength, not the difference in the wavelength there. And if you have the absorption at lambda 1 and emission at lambda 2, so it should be hc 1 by lambda 1 minus 1 by lambda 2, and this will be representing in electron volt only. Okay, because it's a unit of the energy there. One can also use the X-ray to determine the crystal structure. So I will not go into the detail of the X-ray here, but we all know the Bragg's law, right? That 2d sin theta is equal to n lambda. D is the interplanar spacing. So once you have the X-ray XRD pattern like this, eventually you can assign these peaks from the JCPDF file, what is there in the standard JCPDF file. And depending on the intensity of the peaks, you can also assume the shape of these nanocrystals. For example, if you see this particular X-ray spectrum here, so here you have the most intense peak is 002. This implies what? That 002 planes are oriented more than the 100 or 101. Okay, so this gives you the preferred orientation. Immediately you can conclude from here that I have the nanocrystals whose planes 002 planes are oriented. That means this is the growth direction of these nanocrystals. Okay, so now very interestingly, if you take a bulk crystal, so the full width of maximum of these peaks will be very small in case of bulk crystal, because you will have the more oriented plane. But if you have the nanocrystal like that, you'll have finite full width half maximum of these peaks, and from the broadness of this peak, you can also assume the orientation of the planes. Okay, so I was talking about the JCPDS file there. So this JCPDS file looks like that. For example, if you have some peak at set 2 theta 24.929, you can calculate that from this bottom axis. Then it will be indexed as 100 plane. HKL will be 100. Okay, and also you'll have the standard intensity profiles. And once you measure the X-ray from this nanocrystal itself, then you can eventually assign this 2 theta to certain HKL planes, and eventually you can determine the crystallographic phase of this particular nanocrystals. And if you don't know, if you won't have any kind of JCPDS standard file available for your material, because somebody can develop the newly designed material, what to do there? There you take the X-ray and then you do the red belt analysis. So this red belt analysis will eventually give you the crystal structure. Okay, you can model the crystal structure by using this red belt. So this is done for the unknown material in general. Now nanomaterials are very small in size, is in the nanometer regime. So you need to see these nanoparticles, and you cannot see these by means of this optical microscope, right? So that's why one needs the electron microscope, because you need to reach to the diffraction limit. So this is typical electron transmission electron microscope here. So the construction is very similar to the optical microscope, very interestingly. Only the source, light source, is being replaced by the beam of electron. So the diffraction limit is basically increasing, and then you have different kind of condenser lens at the input pathway, also in the output pathway. So these are for the only focusing and defocusing, nothing else. But the basic construction is similar to the light microscope. Okay, but the power of this microscope is very high. You can eventually see the lattice. You see, these are the nanorods here, but along but perpendicular to the length of these nanorods, can you see some small lines? So these lines are basically the lattice fringes. Okay, so these lattice fringes are nothing but the crystal planes. So these are crystal planes. So if you calculate the distance between the adjacent crystal planes here, so eventually you can find the interplanar spacing. So if you have the interplanar spacing like that, eventually you can assign to some crystallographic planes, right? For example, if you find 3.35 angstrom spacing between the intermediate plane, so that could be assigned to 111 HKL plane element. For example, you have, what is this written here? It is written cadmium sulfide. So this is a standard JCPDS file for the cadmium sulfide, and a number is given 80-0019. So if you match this D spacing with certain planes, then eventually you can say that my material is cadmium sulfide, and is D spacing is something like that is measured, and this D spacing is assigned to some HKL, which is say 111 here. And once you do that, eventually you can define the crystallographic phase to be cubic. So this is a cubic cadmium sulfide, and that is being measured from the high resolution HRTM image. So these are the X-ray diffraction. One can use also the electron beam for the diffraction there. So also you can calculate the D spacing from the electron diffraction, and eventually can assign them to certain crystallographic phase. Fine. So these are the synthesis and characterization of these crystals. But after synthesis and characterization, we need to put them into different kind of assemblies, right? So once you talk about the assemblies, you have broadly two different categories. One is the self assembly, another is the directed assembly. What is the difference between self assembly and directed assembly? Directed assembly means you need to put some kind of external force there, but self assembly, it will do itself, right? Okay, so if we take the self assembly, there are different kind of forces what are acting in between these nanocrystals. So one is the van der Waals force, another is the electrostatic interaction, or the interaction between the linkers, means ligands, those are also interacting. Also, if we have a dipolar kind of nanocrystals, so dipole interaction will be there. Also, if you have some kind of drying, then the distance between the nanocrystals will be decreasing, so defined kind of assemblies will be formed. In case of directed assembly, the common thing, you apply the electric field or magnetic field from outside. So if your nanocrystals are electric in nature, then you apply the electric field, and if they're magnetic in nature, so you apply the magnetic field, and eventually you can arrange this nanocrystal in a nice manner. Also, you can apply some kind of mechanical force. Mechanical force means you can use the spin coating technique to assemble these nanocrystals. Okay, so there are different techniques. So this gives you the example that if you are putting a drop of the nanocrystal on top of a solid substrate, and if you allow sufficient time to dry, those nanocrystals can be organized. So this depends on the interparticle forces. Okay, but these all techniques are bulk technique. You won't have any control there. You need very precise control to organize these nanocrystals. So very fortunately, long time back in the year of 1932, Irving Langmuir and Kathleen Blodgett discovered a technique that's called the Langmuir-Blodgett technique. And this technique is a bulk technique, but it works beautifully for the nanocrystals as well as for the molecules. Okay, you are working in a bulk environment, but eventually you can control the organization of the nanocrystals as well as the molecules there. So let's see that typically for this Langmuir-Blodgett technique, amphiphilic molecules are being used. Amphiphilic molecules means what? That it will have a hydrophilic group and it will have a hydrophobic group. So hydrophilic group will attract towards the water, and hydrophobic will always be repelled from the water. So if you put this kind of molecule at the air-water interface, so the hydrophilic part will be towards the water and hydrophobic part will be away from the water. So that's why a molecular organization is forming at the air-water interface. So now let's try to see that how to form and how to work with the Langmuir-Blodgett technique. Okay, first thing is that since you are working at the nanometer level with the nanomaterials or with the molecules, the environment should be very clean. So where you are installing the Langmuir-Blodgett trough, so that room should be absolutely clean. Okay, and we use the term subphase because we can put water within this Langmuir-Blodgett trough. We can use mercury or glycerol, whatever, depending on your purpose. You can choose different kind of liquids there as subphase of this Langmuir trough, and then you need to choose the molecule with or nanomaterial with what you are starting to do your experiment, but that should be insoluble to the subphase. For example, if you take a molecule which is water soluble, it won't work with the water surface. Okay, so it has to be water insoluble, and then you spread this molecule from a volatile solvent. Why you are using volatile solvent? Because you don't need that solvent to be there. You need only the nanomaterial or molecule at the air-water interface. So use some kind of volatile solvent and allow sufficient time to evaporate the solvent, and your molecules will be at the air-water interface then. So how to monitor the organization of this nanomaterial or molecules at the air-water interface? For that, you need something which is called surface pressure. It is surface pressure means since you are working at the two-dimensional environment, it's not regular. It's not like regular pressure. Okay, so since it is two-dimensional environment, it is called the surface pressure. So it's nothing. It is basically measuring the difference between the surface tension of the clean surface as nanomaterial or molecule. Okay, so that's why it is given as the difference in the surface tension. So one can monitor the surface pressure just by measuring the difference in the surface tension there. I'll tell that how to measure it physically. Okay, so it is very delicate technique, very delicate technique. You just need a balance and you need a piece of paper. Okay, filter paper. So you take the filter paper, okay, you hang it with the balance and dip partially inside the water. So now let's count that the length of the entire piece of paper is L, and it is being immersed within the water through a height of h, and the thickness of this paper is say t. And so what will happen then? We'll have different kind of forces. First thing is the gravitational forces due to the gravity that acts downward. Then you have the buoyancy that acts upward, okay, and then you have the forces of the due to the surface or liquid there, okay. So what is the resultant force? The resultant force will be like this. This is the force due to the gravity which acts downwards. This is the force due to the buoyancy, okay, and this is the force due to the surface tension. So you see there is a term 2 there. Why there is a term 2? Because for a piece of paper you will have two different planes, so that's why you have the term 2 here. And also a theta c means once you are emerging this piece of paper in the air water interface, so some kind of meniscus will form. So this meniscus can be in the upward, this meniscus can be in the downward, but this is the critical angle that it forms, okay. So that's why this theta c comes in. Fine. So now see very intelligently that what will happen. You first measure this force in absence of any molecule or nanomaterial, okay, and then you spread your molecules or nanomaterials at the air water interface, and you again measure that force. So if you want to find out the difference in the surface tension, so this is the difference between these two forces. So these two terms will cancel out, and eventually you'll have the term due to the surface tension there. So S0 is the surface tension in absence of any material, means molecule is the surface tension in presence of this nanomaterial or molecule there. So eventually the delta F, which is the difference between the force, is comes to be like this: 2S0 minus SF, and we have the width of the paper and thickness of the paper, plus we have the critical angle. So the difference in the surface tension is defined as the surface pressure, as I told before. So you replace this term by means of difference in the by means of the surface pressure, which is basically the difference in the surface tension. So pi term will come here, and eventually the force will be 2 pi, because you are replacing this with pi, 2 pi W plus T cos theta C. Now let us count one thing. If we have the meniscus which is perfectly aligning with the plane of the waters, then there won't be any critical angle there. So if we won't have any critical angle, then theta C will be 0. As a result of that, cos theta will be 1. Okay. And typically the width of this paper plate is taken to be 1 centimeter. Fine. And the thickness, a piece of paper, the thickness is very small, right? So you can neglect this thickness there. So eventually the delta F is coming to be 2 pi. Fine. So if you want to measure the surface pressure, so eventually the surface pressure is half of the measured force. And you can measure this by simply using a balance. This is very easy technique, but very delicate. Okay. So that's how the Landau-Blodgett trap works. So you have a trap which is coated of the Teflon, and then you have the barrier here. Okay. Barrier means it is also a Teflon bar, but this can be moved by using computer control motors. And these are your molecules and materials what you have. So you spread at the air water interface from a volatile solvent, and you start compressing the barrier by means of computer control motor very slowly. So eventually you will have the organization of the molecules or nanomaterials at the air water interface. Okay. So the technique is very delicate. So during this process, you are always measuring the force. And once you are measuring the difference in the forces, you are getting the difference in the surface tension, surface pressure, I'm sorry. So this curve shows the surface pressure versus area per molecule or molecular area. Because once you are compressing at the different stages, you are basically bringing the molecule closer to each other. As a result of that, the molecular area is changing, and from there, you know the amount that you have spread at the air-water interface. You can calculate the area per molecule from there. So that's why it is represented in area per molecule here. But one can also plot the molecular area. Okay. So this plot shows that different phase transition happens during this compression. So at the initial phase, once you have a big trough and you spread say few microliter, few hundred microliter of your nanomaterials or molecular solvent, then at the beginning of the experiment, you have a large intermolecular distances. Okay. Now, if you are compressing that one, this molecule will start to come closer to each other. So once you have a larger distance, it basically mimics the gaseous phase because the intermolecular distance is large like gas molecules. But once you are compressing that by means of barrier, the intermolecular distances will be reducing, and eventually it can mimic the liquid phase. It's just like the classical phases, because all these phases, liquid, gas, solid, basically depends on the intermolecular distances there. So then, if you compress it furthermore, the molecules will be in tight pack configuration. So that is called the solid phase. Okay. So in solid phase, you see very interesting thing. If you compress it furthermore, but there is no more area for this molecule to come further closer to each other. So what will happen then? Then your area won't be decreased furthermore, but the surface pressure will be rising steeply. Okay. And if you compress it again, then this organization will be broken up and eventually your molecules will be collapsed. That means the molecular organization will be broken completely. Fine. So this is in analogy with the since gas, liquid, solid transitions in the classical bulk, and that follows the classic equation PV equal to RT. But we are doing it at the air-water interface in 2 dimensions. That's why this bulk pressure is replaced basically by this surface pressure, which is pi. And we don't have any volume since you are working at the 2-dimensional interface. So this volume is being replaced by the area actually. So eventually this ideal gas equation can be represented by pi A equal to kT in case of Lamour flame. Hello, are you listening to me? Hello.
Yes, yes.
Okay. Okay. Is being working at the air-water interface there. For example, the van der Waals forces between your molecules and hydrocarbon chains that you are spreading there. Also, you have the ion dipole interaction, which is inversely proportional to the second part of the separation. You have the dipole-dipole interaction, which is also inversely proportional to the third part of the separation. Also, you have the ion-ion interaction there between the like ions or unlike ions. Means if you have the positive, then positive ion interaction, or positive negative ion interaction. Okay. And of course the surface composition. All these are basically responsible for the formation of this Lamour monolayer there. So to give you the example that hydrocarbon interaction, how does it matter in case of Lamour flame? For example, I have taken here 3 different molecules. One is stearic acid that contains C chain. One is myristic acid that contains C14 chain. Another is oleic acid that contains C18. Means we have changed the length of the hydrocarbon here. The surface pressure versus area per molecule, you see, depending on the length of the hydrocarbon here, the behavior at the air-water interface is completely different for 3 different molecules, right? Just we have changed the length of this hydrocarbon and you have the different actions there. Okay, surface composition, I just skip that one. But one important thing for this Lamour experiment is that to check the stability of this monolayer. So in order to check the stability, you have to perform an experiment, which is basically being done by relaxation time. And if it remains in the constant phase, then you can say that my air-water interface flame is stable enough. Okay. But if it is decreasing and then it is increasing again, So you can say that we have the nucleation and growth in this Landmark monolayer. But if it is decreasing in a steady way, then you can say that, well, my flame is not stable there. And also we can lift this Landmark flame onto the solid substrate using different kind of solid substrate, and depending on the nature of the substrate and your molecule, you'll have the different type of deposition. And typically these are defined as the Y type, Z type, and X type deposition. And you can see the difference in the organization of the molecule. This black is the polar head, and this line is the hydrocarbon chain. So for in case of Y type deposition, you have the interaction between hydrocarbon also within these polar heads. So this happens once you are depositing this Landmark flame repetitively in the upstroke and downstroke. Okay, and if it is depositing only in the upstroke, it is called the G type interaction. It happens only the hydrophobic substrate, and once you have the hydrophilic substrate, so this is called the X type of deposition there. Okay, so what's the advantage of this technique? The advantage of the technique is that a perfect molecular two-dimensional interface can be formed, and molecules and nanomaterials can be aligned and transferred onto the solid substrate. I have shown it, that one. And the surface pressure can change the distance between the nanomaterial or molecule, that is called the pitch. So you can control the pitch, and you can deposit many number of layers there. Okay, and you can basically measure the transferred molecules or nanomaterials by calculating the transfer ratio. So that is being done by means of this ratio of this transferred area and the area of the substrate. Because once you are lifting some kind of molecules, some sets of molecules from the air-water interface, so that area is being void, and in that area that molecules will be transferred onto the solid substrate will depend on the subset of the area. So that's why it is the ratio, and for perfect transfer of these molecules or nanomaterials, this transfer ratio should be 1. That means it, whatever you are transferring onto the solid substrate, that will be equal to the area of the solid substrate. Okay, so this transfer ratio is very important parameter to measure that how your film is transferring onto the solid supports there. Also, you cannot, instead of dipping the slide through the air-water interface, you can basically transfer the film by just touching the substrate onto your molecules or nanomaterials. So the picture is basically depicting you that this is a slide what you have, and this is the molecular organization. You just touch this slide onto the molecule, and eventually you can transfer these molecules to the substrate very carefully. Okay, of these slides, but this slide is important. So I give you the example that how the classic monolith formed at the air-water interface by means of this amphiphilic molecule. But one can use the nanomaterials also at the air-water interface, because you see the picture that the timber logs, those are floating at the river surface. Okay, because these cannot immerse within this surface. Okay, so once you spread this timber log, you can always see that they are floating at the air-water interface. That means if you have the immiscible nanomaterials, so those also cannot go inside the water. They will float at the air-water interface then. Okay, so this could be done by means of coating this nanomaterial by means of these surfactants or ligands. So these cannot be miscible with the water. As a result of that, this surfactant coated or ligand coated nanomaterial will be always floating at the air-water interface there. So that gives you the required hydrophobicity, and eventually you can spread these nanomaterials at the air-water interface to form the Landmark monolayer. So this gives how to form, how to use these nanoparticles for this Landmark blockade technique. So for example, I have taken here the zinc sulfide rods. So these small lines are basically zinc sulfide rods. These are only 1 nanometer in diameter and 5 nanometer in length. So once you spread that at the air-water interface, and if you lift that onto the transmission electron microscope grid, eventually you will see that these nanorods remain in small domains, and there is a large separation between the domains at the beginning of the compression. But eventually these domains are basically aligning to particular one direction. So this yellow arrow is showing the direction of the alignments, and you see that most of the nanorods are aligning along this direction of this yellow arrow. Now, if you keep the surface pressure on, you should not compress it furthermore. You just fix the barrier at certain surface pressure. Then you will see that some of these nanorods are basically coalescing into nanowires retaining the same diameter. So this is very interesting observation that I have done nothing. I just kept the surface pressure on, and some of these rods are basically turning into nanowires of same diameter. This is important, the retaining the diameter same. So this circle shows that some rods are already merged or coalesced into nanowires, and the rest of the nanorods are remaining in the aligned form. So now we thought that we should give some kind of heat. So some heat is given water surface there, and you see all the nanorods are turned into nanowires retaining the same diameter. So this is something that you are doing some kind of chemical reaction and giving some amount of heat energy, which is just below the ambient temperature, is 40 degrees Celsius, and eventually you can convert these nanorods into nanowires retaining the same diameter there. So if it works for the nanorod to nanowire conversion, it should also work for the nanowire to other kind of nanosheet formation also. So that also has been tested. So these black lines are basically the zinc selenide nanowires, and eventually you can see how big alignment you can make using this Lamut technique, and eventually you can have aligned area over 2 by 2 square micron. That means that if you have the diameter of a single zinc selenide nanowire to be say 1 nanometer, you are exceeding the aspect ratio, which is the ratio between the diameter and the length of this assembly over 1000 observation that Lamut trap can be used for the alignment of these nanowires also. Also, you can fuse these nanowires in a side-by-side manner. First, you align this nanowire along certain direction by means of this surface pressure, and then you again it for the timing. Eventually, you can see these nanowires are merging in a side-by-side fashion, okay, side-by-side coalescence, and eventually you can obtain a two-dimensional shades. So you have started with one-dimensional conversion, and now from one-dimensional to two-dimensional conversion, and that too has been done at the air-water interface of a Lamut trap. That means you are doing nothing. You are just taking the nanowires or nanorods at the beginning, you are compressing it, and then you are heating it at certain temperature to convert the shape of these nanocrystals. That means you are doing some kind of reaction at the air-water interface of a Lamut trap. Okay. So then you can characterize the thickness of these two-dimensional stuffs. For this case particularly, it is surfactant coated at the top and bottom surfaces of these two-dimensional shades. So you just deduct the height of these surfactants from the top and bottom surfaces. So eventually you can get the thickness of your two-dimensional sheets, and that is to be around 2 nanometer here. So this implies what? With very small thickness. Fine. I skip all these sides. These are not very relevant, but this shows the transmission electron microscopy, which is similar to the atomic force microscope observation. So perfect two-dimensional object can be formed, and these are fully crystalline. At the beginning, I showed you that how to determine the crystallinity by means of this transmission electron microscopy. So now you see that you can eventually see all these lattice planes here. Okay. Also, you can take the diffraction from this object, so you can have the diffraction spots, and from the diffraction spots you can eventually measure the distances and can assign the planes as well as the crystallographic phase of this two-dimensional object. Okay. So now I introduce a new concept that whether this is simply coalescence, that the nanowires came into the closer proximity and then they fused, or there is some tilting during this conversion from the nanowire to two-dimensional object conversion. Okay. So in order to do that, you have to calculate the zone axis. Those who are expert in the crystallography, they know that zone axis calculation is very easy actually. That you have three different directions. That's called let's say I, J, K, and then you have two different planes that you have obtained. So if you take the cross product of those planes, then eventually you can calculate the zone axis. Okay. So this zone axis basically will tell you that if this kind of conversion is straightforward conversion or there is some tilting. So basically this happened that it basically tilts. Why it is tilts? Because say this is your water surface and these are the nanowire you are seeing from the cross-sectional view. Actually the nanowires are extending along this direction, and these are the surfactants or ligands that are coated at the surface of these nanowires. So once you are hitting this water surface, what will happen? The bottom ligands will be heated at first, but the top ligands, they won't be feeling any kind of heat. So as a result of that, once you are giving some kind of energy in the form of heat to the bottom ligands, they will be dislodged from the surfaces, but the upper surfaces will be remaining the intact condition. Okay. So as a result of that, your nanowires will be tilting during this coalescence process in the form of two-dimensional sheets. Okay. And then once you are cooling down the reaction, these ligands can again attach to the surfaces to give the stability to the structures. Okay, that's how one can form.
One here.
Yes.
Can we interrupt you for just 1 second?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. So we have around 10 minutes to complete the presentation and also the interaction, sir.
Okay. Okay. So it's almost done. Okay.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Please go ahead.
So, okay. So just I touch my second again, it means I will speak for another 5 minutes and let's keep 5 minutes for interaction or something like that. Okay. Hello, Dr. Hussain.
Yes.
This is okay, sir. This is okay.
Okay, fine. So now I have shown something with the nanomaterial. Now I'll tell you that whether same technique can be used for some defined kind of molecules. So that we call the supramolecular assemblies. Okay. So basically this is required because once you are dealing with the very highly luminescent molecules in the solid state, so basically the luminescence is going down once you are bringing these molecules into the solid state. So this is called the aggregation caused quenching. So this was first observed by the Fosters a long time back in the year of 1954, but this is very detrimental phenomena because you think about that. Once you are dealing with any kind of solid state devices, so those work basically in the solid state, but you are losing the solid state you are losing the luminescence at the solid state. So that is detrimental for any kind of lighting phenomena. So in opposed to that, there are some other kind of molecules which gives you a very high degree of luminescence in the solid state. So this is called the aggregation induced emission. Means you are bringing the molecules into the solid state and they started to give you the luminescence. For example, you see this one. This is some molecule, this is called the DDPD molecule, parylene tetra carboxylic diamide. So this, if you put in the THF solution, so this is basically luminescent at the solution phase. But if you are bringing it into the aggregate phase, the luminescence is going down. So this is the classic example of aggregation caused quenching. On the other hand, if you have some hexaphenyl silane molecules, so you have a silyl stator here, and then you have the phenyl rings which can rotate. So those are not really luminescence in the dilute solution form. But once you are bringing into the aggregated form, you see the luminescence is coming out. So these two phenomena are completely opposite to each other. But this is very interesting because this gives you the luminescence in the solid state. So this was first observed by the Benjong Tong in the year of 2001, and since then plenty of work has been going on there. So what's the reason? Tentatively, it was told that there are two reasons for this defined phenomena, because in solution, all these phenyl rings can rotate against this silyl stator, and as a result of that, you have the non-radiative decay. But if you can freeze the rotation of this phenyl ring, eventually you can get plenty of luminescence there. So based on that, there are two tentative reasons for this one. One is the restricted intermolecular rotation, and other is the restricted intermolecular vibration. That means you need to freeze the molecules there. So there are techniques to freeze the molecules. So one can do that in solid phase, or one can do it in the powder crystalline form, or to put into the biological cells, in the polymer blends, or even in the layer materials. But none of these techniques are basically technique. So one can use this Landmark blockade technique here, because these are basically aggregation induced genes. Okay, we call it AI genes in short. Once you spread that at the aorta interface, they can form nice hydrogen bonding with the water surface, and that gives a stable Landmark flame there. And if you lift up this flame at different stages and see those by means of atomic force microscopy, so eventually you can see that aggregates are forming at the very beginning of the compression. So see, this image is showing at the very low level of compression, but still you have the aggregated structure there. But the very interesting thing is that once you are increasing the surface pressure, you can align them, or you can form different supramolecular assemblies of these molecules, and as a result of that, a jump in the luminescence can happen. For example, this is not luminescence at all in the solution phase. It was giving 1% of photoluminescence quantum yield, but once you are taking the monolayer LB flame, that quantum yield is jumping to 34 to 39% there. So this is a beauty. And this beauty can be achieved only by means of this Landmark blockade technique, because of the controlled organization of these molecules. Okay, so we have adopted that one for different kind of molecules, and eventually you can form devices, because those are giving luminescence in the solid state. So you can form the solid state device like light emitting high efficiency from these molecules here. So if you now change the functional group, you could have different kind of supramolecular assemblies, but the result is the same. You will always get the high degree of luminescence there. Okay, but this can be achieved only using the Landmark blockade technique, which gives you the molecular level control of this aggregation. Fine. So this is giving you different kind of assembly structures there, but you can use this flame as a sensor also. For example, if you can put cadmium in the subphase and you do the same experiment, so you'll see with the different doses of cadmium, the luminescence will be changing. So that gives you the luminescence sensor for cadmium sensing. Okay, so this gives you the example that without cadmium you have the luminescence like this. Once you are adding the cadmium into the surface, the luminescence is going up to certain concentration, and then after that it is going down again. So it can be used as the luminescence sensor, which can sense the doses of cadmium present in some system. Fine. One can use also the gas sensing. For example, if you have the cadmium containing Landmark flame of these AI genes, then you pass H2S there, and eventually you can see that there is a change in the luminescence there. So this change can be monitored, and this can be used as a gas sensor. So different kind of things that aggregates of these molecules for different sense, different kind of molecules which are different functional group, and depending on the different functional group, they can work in a different way, and they can form different kind of supramolecular assemblies. So you see the different pictures here. So this is one molecule, and if you change the functional group there, the structure of the supramolecular assembly is changing. Okay, this is another kind of AI gene. This is forming spherical ball-shaped aggregates at different phases, and eventually you see the luminescence again. You are getting the very high degree of luminescence, and eventually you can use this luminescence for different kind of sensors. I showed you the cadmium sensing, I showed you the gas sensing. Now this is the mechanochromic sensing. that if we have a original LB film, Lanmud blockade film like this, which is green in color, then you put some kind of acetone vapor here, and then you will get a different cyan color here. Now, if we heat this cyan color, it will go back again to the original green color. That means you can change, you can sense or change the color of the LB film just by means of mechanical deformation. How mechanical deformation is happening here? Because this acetone is basically penetrating within this film and changing the supramolecular organization. But once you are heating this, the acetone is no longer there, it will come back to the original state. Okay, so that's why one can go 2 and 4 color changes by means of this technique, and this is called the mechanochromic luminescence. Okay, very interestingly, this can be used for the security purpose. How security purpose? I showed you that if you fume it with acetone, the color is changing. Now we write here something by means of some pencil or spatula. For example, AIE is written here. Okay, so once you are writing AIE, because of this external pressure, you see the original color is back. Is not it is interesting? The original color is coming back here. Then you again expose it to acetone, it will come back to the original state. So different kind of application, sensing application can be done by using this Lanmud technique, by using these nanomaterials or molecules. Also, one can form the different kind of assemblies there. Okay, devices there. For example, this is the OLED formation, light emitting diode using these molecules. So you see that device is functioning. This is glowing here. Okay, and one can get very high efficiency, external quantum efficiency. This for this device it is 2.5%, which is pretty high in comparison to what is available in the market. But there are reports something like external quantum efficiency of 10% till date. Okay, so one can also use this film for the explosive detection. This the molecule is a explosive molecule. This is called picric acid. So one can use this Lanmud flame to detect picric acid in a trace amount. So this you show this picture shows that this is 0 nanomolar and this is high 1500 nanomolar here. So one can detect at different ranges. That means the trace amount of the explosive devices can be detected by means of this Lanmud technique. Okay, so that's it. I can't continue furthermore. I think you have lunch or you have not finished the lunch, waiting for that one.
Thank you very much for
thank you.
Nice presentation. And yeah, I mean to say that we in the beginning we had some issues in the audio, but after that the audio was absolutely crystal clear, and many participants were writing in the chat boxes that this was very informative. And in fact, one of the participants asked about how we can link these findings with the sensor technology, and I think in the last part of the presentation you nicely briefed about that. So now the presentation is open for discussion. If you have any question, you can just write in the chat box and we can put that question up to Professor Acharya. So we have around 2-3 minutes for discussion.
Sure.
And Professor Acharya, we have already circulated the Google form with the questions that you kindly provided, and people are submitting that. And since this is an AICTE sponsored program, this is they have made a mandate to assess the participants in a continuous manner. So
yeah.
Okay, so we have. Can you see the chat window, sir? Go to the chat window. We have a question.
Yeah. We have a question from
Quantum loss can be
Usha Raghavan.
something like results show wrong. So
Result show
Okay, so I will intervene here. I will request the
Good.
participant to submit,
Optili,
submit,
sing, okay.
and then we will correct it if it is wrong. Okay, so please keep on
Yeah, yeah,
submitting.
yeah.
Okay.
Oh, okay, okay. So the quantum dots can be used in dash optoelectronics. Results show wrong. I mean, this is a question or what?
Sir, we will take care of it, sir. We will take care of it.
Okay.
So I
Okay. Okay.
request the participants to please complete whatever they want to complete, and if something is wrong, that we will take care of that. Please.
Yes. Yes. Certainly. Certainly. Yeah.
So if you have participants, if you have any questions, you can ask, or
In chat box already there is some questions.
the chat box is a serial box. So can you please just write the thing again, because it's a long list.
Sir,
Please ask the question.
may I ask a question?
Please go
Yeah.
ahead.
Sure.
Sir, there was a phenomena, aggregation enhanced luminescence, right? And which was explained in terms of the fixing the orientation, basically rotation or vibrational, right? So how do we confirm experimentally the rotation or vibration, right, of a molecule?
See, there are
right?
plenty of tools. You see the FTIR, Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy is there. Raman spectroscopy is there. Okay. So this could be used for detection that if you have frozen intermolecular interaction or not. Also, you can use the X-ray. Okay. Because if you have a different structure, which is where the molecules are restricted, they cannot rotate. So you'll have different kind of crystal structure there. So they are complementary technique to probe that one, that if we have a frozen structure or not. Also, you can probe it by means of spectroscopy. For example, if you take the luminescence spectroscopy, means fluorescence spectroscopy at room temperature, and you do the same experiment at low temperature at 77K. So at 77K, you will have the frozen structure. Okay. So if your luminescence at room temperature and 77K appear in the same position, although the intensities are different, then you can tell that you have arrested those molecules in the room temperature experimental condition.
Okay, so like it's like oriented dipoles, right? Parallel oriented dipoles leads to the enhanced luminescence, observed luminescence.
Not necessarily. They might not be parallel. They could be. No, yeah, they. No. It's not that kind of aggregate, because if you have that kind of aggregate which is called the J aggregate or H type of aggregate, those are parallel or perpendicular. No, not like that, because in case of J type of aggregate, you have the pi interaction. But if you have the pi interaction, your luminescence will be quenching down, giving you the aggregation cost quenching. Okay. Here, the chromophoric distances are much larger. That prevents. So that's why dipolar kind of stuff is less important here. Here, important is that you orient this molecule at a certain distance, which is a bit larger. The distance between the adjacent molecules will be a bit larger, and you fix the rotation and vibration. So that will eventually open up some of these non-radiative pathways, and eventually it will become luminescent.
Thank you very much, sir, for your nice explanation. So can we share your presentation? Can you share your presentation so that we can share it to the people if you want?
Okay, sure.
So you can send to Dr. Hussain to his email ID. We'll be sharing the presentation.
Okay.
And since we are limited on time, sir,
certainly.
If
I'll do that.
If you allow, then we will also share the
I understand.
email ID to all the participants, so that if they want to interact with you, they can send email to you, sir.
Okay. Sure.
So let us thank Professor Atiyar for his nice and lucid presentation, which enlightened a lot of things on the nano size, not only on that, but also its applicability in the sensor technology. And sir, we are really delighted to have you on our program, and we will look forward to have your presentation in near future also. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
So
Thank
now
you very much.
participants, we
So
will
I am
bring-
quitting.
Yeah, please. Yeah, thank you, sir. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
So for the participants, next speaker will be from Colin Price from Israel, and please log in within 2:30. So we told you that there will be 30 minutes break, but there will be 15 minutes break. We are sorry for the shortage of time, because we could have extended it much larger, but let us continue the flow. So please come again to the meeting room within 2:30 sharp. Thank you very much. Dr. Mrityunjay Mahato, please mute your microphone.
Yes. Sorry,
No problem.
I was trying to contact with the resource persons. Okay.